Harold and Elaine Whitmore were the couple everyone on Brookfield Lane thought they knew he, the hard-working father, and she, the devoted mother. But behind their closed doors, neighbors heard the screams, the crashes, the desperate cries for help. They heard everything, yet no one acted, and by the time the truth finally surfaced, it was far too late to save the Whitmore family. Brookfield Lane was the kind of suburban street that realtors love to show off in glossy brochures. Wide sidewalks curved neatly around cul-de-sacs, front yards were dotted with rose bushes and bird feeders, and the air always seemed just a little quieter than the busy city streets only a few miles away. On weekends, children rode bicycles in small groups, while parents watered their lawns or waved from porches. It was a place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. Or at least that's what the people who lived there told themselves. Yet, beneath that perfect surface, behind the closed doors of one particular house, something dark was brewing. The Whitmore family blended in effortlessly with their surroundings. Harold, the father, worked as a supervisor at a local construction company, often seen leaving in his work truck before sunrise. Elaine, the mother, was known for her involvement in the local school and her careful attention to her children's activities. Melissa, the teenage daughter, was shy and soft-spoken, while Adam, her younger brother, was full of energy and often played soccer in the yard. To anyone who passed by, they seemed perfectly ordinary, another snapshot of suburban normalcy. But neighbors who paid closer attention noticed details that didn't fit the picture. Late at night, when the rest of the street was winding down and porch lights were flickering off one by one, the Whitmore house would come alive with noise. Muffled shouting seeped through the thin walls, escalating into crashing sounds that rattled the quiet. Sometimes the shouting was deep and booming. Other times, it was desperate and pleading. Several neighbors admitted they paused at their windows, straining to make sense of the chaos next door. A few whispered among themselves that Harold had a temper, that Elaine was often the target, but no one wanted to interfere. It was easier to brush it off as marital issues that weren't their business. On more than one occasion, someone on the street claimed to have heard a piercing scream that jolted them awake in the middle of the night. One woman confessed that she lay in bed with her heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, and wondering if she should call the police. But by morning, when sunlight bathed the neighborhood in its familiar glow, she convinced herself she had exaggerated what she heard. After all, there were no sirens, no signs of injury, and the Whitmores always appeared at community events looking tired but intact. That fragile illusion of normalcy was enough to keep the doubts buried. The children became an unspoken reminder that something was wrong. Melissa often walked to school with her head down, avoiding eye contact, her clothes wrinkled as if she had slept in them. Adam grew quieter over time, no longer shouting with laughter in the yard, but instead kicking his soccer ball alone in silence. Neighbors noticed but told themselves children went through phases. They convinced themselves that families were complicated, that arguments didn't always mean danger. Deep down, many of them knew there was something sinister happening just a few doors away, but they clung to the comfort of denial. What no one realized was that their silence would carry a terrible cost. The sounds they brushed off as routine arguments were not just signs of an unhappy marriage. They were desperate cries for help. Elaine's voice, trembling with fear in the middle of the night, was not simply a quarrel between spouses. The truth was waiting, buried in shadows behind the white picket fences of Brookfield Lane, and when it finally came to light, the entire street would never see itself the same way again. Elaine Whitmore's disappearance began quietly, almost too quietly, which is perhaps why so many people accepted the explanation Harold gave without asking harder questions. One morning, she was simply no longer there. The curtains in the Whitmore home were drawn. Harold went about his usual routine, and when someone eventually asked where Elaine had gone, he delivered his story with such practiced calm that it left little room for doubt. According to Harold, she had been seeing someone in secret, a lover she had hidden for years, and she finally decided to walk away from her marriage and family to start fresh. He spoke of her with a tone that mixed irritation with resignation, as though he were the victim of betrayal rather than the center of suspicion. To the neighbors who had long heard the fights, the story carried a strange plausibility. Perhaps Elaine had grown tired of living with a short-tempered husband and decided to escape. Others, however, were troubled by the way things didn't add up. Elaine was known for being devoted to her children. She attended every school play, helped organize bake sales, and could often be found chatting with other mothers outside the elementary school. The idea that she would walk out in the night without saying a word to Melissa or Adam seemed impossible. Melissa's best friend confided to her own parents that Elaine had never once hinted at unhappiness when they spoke, and that she always seemed focused on her family rather than herself. More questions surfaced when people noticed what Elaine had left behind. Her car remained parked in the driveway, untouched for days. Her purse, with her driver's license and credit cards, was reportedly still in the house. She hadn't withdrawn any money from the bank, nor had she contacted her friends or family members. For a woman who was supposedly running off with someone new, she left behind every essential part of her life. Harold dismissed this as impulsive behavior, insisting Elaine was emotional and careless when she made decisions. He painted her as unstable, someone who could easily abandon responsibilities in pursuit of passion. His tone made it sound like he expected others to believe him without hesitation. But the most disturbing detail was the timing. A neighbor across the street later recalled waking in the middle of the night to a chilling scream. It was sharp, desperate, and unlike the muffled arguments they were used to hearing. The scream had come only hours before Harold claimed his wife disappeared. At the time, the neighbor froze, unable to decide whether it was real or imagined. They told themselves they must have been half asleep, that perhaps a fox or stray animal had made the sound. In daylight, the thought of calling the police felt foolish. Now, with Elaine missing, the memory gnawed at them, though still they chose silence. Inside the Whitmore household, the children were visibly unraveling. Melissa appeared withdrawn, her face pale and eyes swollen as though she hadn't slept. Adam avoided conversations entirely, answering questions with shrugs or silence. Yet when people asked Harold how the children were coping, he brushed it off, claiming they were simply adjusting to their mother's absence. He assured everyone that Elaine would call eventually, that she would explain herself when the time was right. Still, the unease grew, whispered about on porches and over fences. Every day that passed without word from Elaine made the story harder to believe, but no one wanted to confront Harold. Fear, doubt, and the desire to avoid conflict kept everyone quiet. That quiet, as time would prove, was the most dangerous thing of all. As weeks bled into months, the strange absence of Elaine Whitmore became just another fact of life on Brookfield Lane. People still whispered about her, still wondered privately where she had gone, but the neighborhood's rhythm carried on. Children played, sprinklers sprayed across bright green lawns, and the Whitmore house, with its shut blinds and unkempt garden, simply became a reminder of a story no one dared to question out loud. But it wasn't long before signs began to appear, signs that something far more sinister had taken place, signs that even the most willfully blind neighbor could no longer ignore. The first was the smell. It started faint, an odd odor that drifted across the fences on warm afternoons. At first, people blamed garbage bins left too long in the sun, or perhaps a dead animal trapped beneath a porch. But as the summer heat grew stronger, the scent intensified into something unmistakable. It was thick, sour, and carried a weight that made stomachs turn. Neighbors wrinkled their noses while working in their yards, muttering about how Harold needed to take care of his supposed rodent problem. Some even joked nervously that he must have a raccoon buried under his shed. The laughter was thin, however, masking the unease no one wanted to name. Alongside the smell came unsettling sights. Several people noticed Harold digging in the backyard late at night, illuminated only by the dim glow of a lantern. He worked in silence, his movements deliberate, his shirt clinging to him with sweat. A few neighbors, peering through slats in their blinds, claimed they saw him cover the ground quickly when he realized someone might be watching. On one occasion, a resident swore they spotted him hauling a heavy tarp toward the shed, its dark surface smeared with stains. No one asked him about it directly. Instead, they exchanged nervous glances with one another, murmuring suspicions but taking no action. The thought of accusing a man of murder without proof was unthinkable. It was safer to stay quiet, to tell themselves there had to be another explanation. Inside the Whitmore home, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier. Melissa and Adam, once visible in the neighborhood, rarely came outside anymore. When Melissa was seen, her face looked gaunt, her eyes darting nervously as though she carried a terrible secret she could not share. Adam's cheerful energy had vanished completely, replaced by a blankness that unsettled anyone who saw him. The children's silence only deepened the neighbors' discomfort. They could sense something dreadful was happening in that house, but still, they told themselves it was not their business. The turning point came on a sweltering evening, when the smell grew so unbearable that even those who had ignored it could no longer pretend. Windows were shut tightly to keep the odor out, yet it lingered in the air like an accusation. Gossip spread more urgently now. Some insisted Elaine was buried in the backyard. Others muttered that Harold must have slaughtered animals for some secret purpose. But the police were never called. Fear of being wrong, fear of causing conflict, and fear of what the truth might reveal kept every phone silent. It was not the adults who finally broke the silence, but Melissa, living under the weight of what she knew, became unbearable. And one night, she made a choice that would rip apart the fragile facade of Brookfield Lane. Her confession would unravel everything her father had tried to bury, both in the ground and in the minds of those who had chosen not to see. Melissa Whitmore could only carry the secret for so long before the weight began to suffocate her. For weeks, she had lived in constant fear, tiptoeing through her own home, terrified of saying or doing anything that might set her father off. Every night, she lay awake, listening to his footsteps, moving through the darkened hallways, waiting for the creak of her bedroom door, praying it would never open. The lies he told the neighbors played in her mind on a loop, twisting the truth into something unrecognizable. But Melissa knew what really happened the night her mother disappeared. She had heard the screams, she had seen the violence, and she had watched her father dig the shallow grave behind the shed while warning her and Adam that if they ever spoke, they would join Elaine in the ground. At first, Melissa tried to protect her brother by pretending everything was normal. She forced herself to go to school, to smile faintly at friends, to answer teachers with mechanical politeness. Inside, however, she was unraveling. She could barely eat. Her body trembled at the sound of her father's voice. Each time he looked at her across the dinner table, his eyes cold and unblinking, she was reminded of the night he had taken their mother's life. Adam, younger and more fragile, clung to her constantly. His silence spoke volumes, his wide eyes filled with questions he was too afraid to ask. The final breaking point came late one evening when Harold cornered Melissa in the kitchen. He accused her of being ungrateful, of sneaking behind his back, of knowing too much. His words were sharp, each one a blade cutting deeper into her resolve. Melissa realized then that staying silent was no longer protecting her brother. It was only condemning both of them to a slow, inevitable destruction. That night, after Harold had gone to bed, she gathered every ounce of courage she had left and slipped out the back door. Across the street, she knocked frantically on a neighbor's door, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When the door opened, The sight of Melissa, pale, disheveled, and shaking, was enough to alarm anyone. In a rush of tears and broken sentences, she revealed the truth. Her father had killed her mother during one of their violent arguments, striking her again and again until she no longer moved. Melissa described the horrifying sounds of that night, the way Elaine's voice had grown weaker until it disappeared altogether. She told of watching Harold drag her mother's body out to the backyard, of hearing the scrape of the shovel against the earth, of the sickly sweet smell that later rose from the ground. Most chilling of all, she explained the threats. Her father had looked directly at her and Adam and promised that if they ever spoke, he would bury them alongside Elaine. The neighbor listened, horrified, torn between disbelief and dread. Yet, instead of immediately calling the police, doubt crept in. What if Melissa was exaggerating? What if grief had twisted her perception? What if Harold found out they had gone to the authorities and retaliated? Fear paralyzed the neighbor into hesitation, a hesitation that would soon prove devastating. Melissa's confession was the key to saving both herself and her brother. But because of one person's uncertainty, the truth remained hidden in the dark. A little longer, and Harold was given more time to destroy what was left of his family. The silence on Brookfield Lane stretched on until it was shattered in the most horrifying way. Melissa's desperate attempt to confide in a neighbor had not brought the rescue she hoped for. The neighbor, paralyzed by uncertainty and fear of being wrong, had chosen inaction. That hesitation gave Harold exactly what he needed: time. But time did not bring calm. It only deepened the cracks in his already fractured mind. The pressure of suspicion, the whispers he knew were circulating, and the constant presence of his children, who had seen too much, began to gnaw at him until his control slipped completely. The breaking point came one suffocating summer night. The neighborhood air was heavy and still, windows open to catch the smallest breeze. That was when the sounds started: loud crashes from the Whitmore home, furniture toppling, sharp cries of terror that carried down the quiet street. Several neighbors later admitted they had heard it all. Some stood frozen at their windows, others turned up their televisions to drown it out, telling themselves someone else would step in if it was serious. But no one picked up the phone. No one called for help. Inside the house, Harold's rage had turned its focus on Adam. The boy had grown restless under his father's control, whispering too many questions to Melissa, showing too many signs of fear that Harold interpreted as defiance. Melissa tried to shield him, begging her father to stop, but Harold, unraveling under his paranoia, lashed out with unrelenting violence. The sounds that poured from the Whitmore home that night were not the sounds of an ordinary family argument. They were the sounds of lives ending. By the time the police were finally called, ironically, not by a neighbor but by a distant relative who had grown concerned after weeks of unanswered messages, it was too late. Officers forced their way into the home and were met with a scene that would haunt them forever. Harold sat eerily calm in the garage, his hands and clothes smeared with blood, as though the chaos had burned itself out of him and left only a hollow shell. Behind the house, beneath the weathered boards of the tool shed, they uncovered the remains of Elaine exactly where Melissa had said they would be. Nearby, they found the lifeless body of young Adam, hastily buried in a shallow grave. Melissa was discovered barely clinging to life. Harold had turned his fury on her too. But somehow, she had survived long enough to be found. Her fragile frame told the story her neighbors had ignored for months: the bruises, the exhaustion, the silent pleas hidden in her downcast eyes. She was the only one left to carry the truth, though it had cost her everything. The aftermath sent shockwaves through Brookfield Lane. News vans crowded the street, reporters asking the same question again and again. How could so many people hear everything and yet do nothing? Neighbors avoided eye contact with cameras, guilt written in the lines of their faces. They had convinced themselves they were protecting their peace, avoiding trouble, respecting privacy. In reality, their silence had been complicity. Brookfield Lane was never the same again. The laughter of children no longer echoed there, and the tidy suburban homes felt hollow, like painted shells hiding rot beneath the surface. For the rest of their lives, the residents carried the weight of knowing that the blood of the Whitmore family did not rest solely on Harold's hands. It also stained theirs, for every time they turned away, every time they told themselves it was not their problem, every time they heard the cries and chose to remain silent. The screams of that house did not vanish. They lingered, echoing through the quiet street, a permanent reminder of the terrible price of doing nothing.